I'm discussing this again now, huh? Almost 4 years ago, I made this video analyzing and discussing the character Flint from the game Mother 3, and in the time since then, I've grown discontent with this video. There's no one thing about it that makes me dissatisfied about the video, just a lot of things. Like, I feel like my editing was poor, the way I explained my points felt ineloquent, and I spent way too long just plot summarizing, which I feel is a cardinal sin amongst video essays. So, I feel like it's time I have one more crack at this topic and finally put to rest my feelings regarding Flint. Yeah, I know you all probably know what Mother 3 is by now, but let's just give a brief recap to set the stage for this video. Mother 3 is a Japan-only video game released in 2006 for the Game Boy Advance. The third entry in the Mother series, the game had a very rough development cycle, resulting in the game taking 12 years to release. An unclear, although notable amount of work was completed for an ultimately unreleased version of the game for the Nintendo 64, and after this, the game changed immensely with its transition to the GBA, with completely different visuals, heavily reworked gameplay mechanics, and even certain altered plot elements. The game has a cast of very memorable characters: Lucas, Kumatora, Duster, Boney, Salsa, and... I could do a preliminary assessment on who Flint is to introduce him for this video, but I feel like it'd actually make more sense to go over a few of his official character bios to help in painting the picture of who he is. I have this guidebook and this magazine that covers Mother 3. Let's see what both have to say about Flint. This issue of Weekly Famitsu says, "He's strong, a family man, the reliable father of Lucas and Klaus, but no one knows what his job is. According to the villagers, he's a reckless, nice guy. Does his nonchalantness bother you?" Meanwhile, this guidebook says, "He's Lucas and Klaus's father who wears a hat that always covers his eyes. While usually calm and quiet, he can spring into action with incredible recklessness and bravery. A reliable figure not just to his family, but to the whole village. Truly the manliest of men." I'd also like to bring up this other guidebook, which basically says the same thing as the previous guide, but also mentions at the end he loves his wife Hinawa. So, main points are, he's reserved, but reliable and brave, even if he's a bit reckless. Flint, of course, as with pretty much every Mother 3 character, existed way back when this game was being developed on N64 too. Here's an official bio for him from an issue of Famimaga. "A leader-like figure to Tazmily Village. He's the kind who possesses both wisdom and courage, and he has a loving wife and twin sons. However, he apparently has a bit of a naive side." Hopefully that gives a pretty clear picture as to what type of character Flint is written to be like from some official sources. I will have more to say regarding his characterization in regards to these bios, but I will get to that shortly. Now, it's time I outline his role in Mother 3's story for the GBA. I won't meander here, I promise. Flint is the protagonist of Chapter 1. During this chapter, we're shown that his peers, the villagers of Tazmily, see him as a reckless but nice man. In short, he saves fuel from a burning house, attempts to find his missing wife and children, encounters creepy pig people who unleash disturbing mechanical animal hybrids, breaks down hearing about his wife's death, gets knocked out, is forced to miss out on almost all of his wife's funeral whilst many of the villagers have begun to distrust him due to his outbursts the previous night. He then goes on a race against time to find his son Klaus, who's run off to fight the monster that killed his mother, all wrapping up with Klaus being shown motionless while Flint and his father-in-law fail to find Klaus's corpse. Flint next appears at the end of Chapter 2 to help break up the commotion in the village square, entrusting that the missing Duster will come back. You can also see Flint partway through Chapter 3, tending to his sheep. Then, the time skip occurs. You can see Flint by Hinawa's grave where he urges Lucas to speak to his mother. And then Flint goes off screen for almost the rest of the game. You hear hints around town that he's busted a lock again at the jail, is distant from his former close acquaintances, and generally isn't seen much by anyone. Then in the 7th chapter, you learn through Napolite the Gravedigger that despite Flint's routine of mourning for Hinawa and searching for his missing son Klaus, Lucas is his one and only salvation left, and gives to Napolite to pass on to Lucas a courage badge, a symbol of Flint's courage being passed down to his son. Then, finally, during Mother 3's final chapter, Flint reappears, ready to finally see for himself what's up with that mysterious commander. It turns out that that child soldier was Klaus the whole time, much to the shock of Flint and the player, as Flint's hat finally flies off and exposes Flint's vulnerable and weaker self for the first time. Lucas eventually gets into his final encounter with his brother, which during said fight, Flint shields Lucas during two of the Masked Man's strongest attacks, being heavily injured in the process. Hinawa's spirit manages to bring Klaus's agency and humanity back to him, and Klaus finally rests in peace, with Flint giving Lucas his final encouragement to pull the last dragon needle and save the world with his pure heart. And that's it. Flint plays an immensely interesting role in Mother 3, there is no denying it, and I do think those official character bios are pretty alright in giving a short and sweet summary of who he is based on what we see of him. However, part of why I wanted to make this video in the first place was to compare and contrast to everything we know regarding Flint's original role in the Nintendo 64 version of Mother 3, as well as earlier builds of the GBA version. Flint, out of almost every main character, had his role changed the most, as far as we know. Let's shoot through all the differences we know of. In regards to the pre-time skip chapters of Mother 3, there aren't very many known changes regarding Flint. If anything, he essentially had his role in the story stay the same from initial conception up to the final game. The only major difference of note that we know of is that he was supposed to have PSI abilities, or rather, magic abilities. If you don't know anything about EB64, it's just the game's equivalent of PSI. Anyways, what he was doing in the post-time skip chapters are the points of interest. In EB64, Flint was to have a design Chapter 4 onwards that differed from his pre-time skip one. His hair was to have gone grey, with his trench coat tattered, a nice visual metaphor for how time had taken a toll on Flint. Instead of disappearing off screen, Flint was supposed to join you in the 4th chapter. While we can't be certain of very specific details, we know that he was supposed to join Lucas and Boney in their journey to find Duster at Club Titiboo. Following on, it's also known that instead of Kumatora joining you in Chapter 5, Flint would carry on with his son and dog, now joined by Duster, to search for the Egg of Light, infiltrate a pig mask facility and wear disguises, and finish off the chapter with pointing out the Masked Man as someone familiar. Chapter 6 was to have Flint be involved in some way as opposed to the final game, where he's completely not present. Going off unused sprites, it seems that Flint was to recognize Hinawa's ghost and say something to her, before joining her by jumping up towards her, to which Lucas would jump to. Flint in Chapter 7 is still a mystery. However, from the small bits of info we do know, it can be deduced that Flint almost certainly wasn't to join your party in this chapter, unlike how he does in Chapters 4 and 5. Without getting super into speculation territory, I'd say it's reasonable to infer that it was planned for Flint himself to give Lucas the courage badge, instead of it being delivered via Napolite giving it on behalf of Flint. And Chapter 8 is very interesting. Well, the second part isn't as much so I'll get that out of the way. Unused GBA text shows that Wes, Dr. Andernuts, and Flint were to help Lucas's party in the battle against the Porkybots, as opposed or in addition to just the DCMC. Before that though, we got confirmation last year that, in EB64, during Ledda's explanation of Tazmilly's past and the White Ship, it would have been implied that before the events of the White Ship, Flint was someone of significance in some capacity, and the player would more or less be able to figure out what his previous identity would have been. And with that comment in mind from Mystery Toy, that he knew people would be speculating Flint might actually be Ness, I'll let you draw your conclusions from there. My conclusion though is that while that's an interesting interpretation and headcanon, it's not the definitive explanation. Flint could have been someone else still somehow important regarding the White Ship or something. We don't have the full story, and it is also just up for alternate interpretations. Either way, the takeaway is that Flint was to have an immensely more active role in the story. What's interesting is that Flint's role between versions of the game did even change to some degree over time before he was completely cut as playable from the later chapters in the game. Flint's magic / PSI abilities seemingly were never implemented into the GBA version at any point, despite him having those powers in the N64 game, and furthermore, any mentions of Flint during the White Ship backstory were seemingly entirely omitted from the GBA version, with no text or graphical remnants left over that indicate he was to have been mentioned during that part of the game. It has never been officially stated as to why in Mother 3, Flint's role during the latter half of the game changed so heavily. However, Shigesato Itoi did sort of indirectly explain the change. In a 2015 Nintendo Dream interview, he explains that sometime during the GBA version's development, one of the staff members for the game had a child and became a father. Mr. Itoi thought that Flint constantly looking for one of his children would be dragging it out for too long, and that he would eventually move on from it. But this aforementioned staff member said a father would normally look for their child every single day, and that made Itoi realize that's more of a human reaction. Yes, I'm just a game writer after all. So Flint constantly searches for his son off-screen. I feel like this answers some of the questions many would have about Flint, and yet it does raise more questions, I feel, and I'll get into that soon. This is the part of the video I've been looking forward to the most. There is just so much I can say regarding Flint and what role he has in the game. Ironically though, there isn't too much for me to actually say regarding him in the first chapter that I didn't already go over in my Klaus analysis video, but there's still a pretty interesting point I need to delve into, and it does actually relate somewhat heavily to him in the later parts of the game too. It's regarding what it means that Flint is only playable in the first chapter. One thing I've seen interpreted from this is that Flint is a pacifist. More specifically, after his breakdown over Hinawa's death, Flint never harms another person for the rest of the entire game, which includes the pig masks. This is supported by Flint never fighting any human characters during his time as playable, which in pre-release material he was planned to do, judging by screenshots of him fighting pig masks in the forest. And that with Flint not joining Lucas's party later in the game, he of course isn't fighting the same fights they are. I think this is a super interesting interpretation of Flint's character, as in he was so personally rattled by his outburst that he doesn't want to harm another person physically again, and that's why the game never lets you have him to fight against the pig masks. It's all the more interesting considering Lucas's deep instilled fears that his father would raise his hand to him. Even if Flint genuinely did become a pacifist, the damage on Lucas's subconscious was already done, and this also applies to Klaus and the villagers in Tazmily too. With Klaus, he's determined to stop the Mecha Drago no matter what, and runs off before Flint has any chance to stop him and save his son from making the same mistake of getting into an altercation that's going to end with a loss of consciousness or worse. And with the villagers, this is where so many of them begin to distrust him. It doesn't matter if Flint never hits another person again after this, their perception is altered irreparably. And with that, it is interesting too in the sense that it's not Flint's burden really to keep up appearances after having such traumatic events occur to his family, and while plenty of the villagers are still at least amicable with him, it's upsetting knowing that even just a few of them couldn't and didn't want to understand his perspective regarding himself and his actions. But even that is just an appetizer of a point. As for the post-time skip chapters, there is so much to say, despite Flint being off-screen for almost all of this time. Here's my main point of discussion I want to talk about with this video. So from the beginning of chapter 4, you take control of Lucas, and from his perspective, you see that Flint is physically distant, as in, he's literally difficult to find. You can see him by Hinawa's grave where he tells you to say hi to her since it's been a while since you've seen her, and then you literally do not see him again until chapter 8. What does this mean? Well, I'm going to give my interpretation based on every little detail the game provides. As with many of the plot details in Mother 3, the game does not specifically say what Flint was up to between chapters 3 and 4. We don't know what happened precisely during the 3 years. In other words, we can only infer what's happened based on what's said by the NPCs and other details. But going off the Tazmily villagers' assessments of Flint is unreliable. If you've read much of the dialogue from these characters from chapter 4 onwards, you'll know that many of the NPCs in Tazmily are biased and dislike Lucas or think he's stupid. This of course extends to Flint too. Just because they say he's always searching in the mountains doesn't mean he literally does that. It's made very clear by other dialogue that these NPCs give that Flint doesn't converse much with many of his former acquaintances and friends of the village, and for good reason, considering how many of them are indoctrinated by the happy boxes, and how Flint and Lucas never obtain any themselves. That said, one would have to imagine Flint probably would actually have explored a lot of the islands than just that one area of the mountains. In fact, if you go up into the mountains at any point during chapters 4 through 7, you don't see Flint there. This wasn't the developers forgetting to place Flint up there, it was deliberate design to make you question what precisely he was and is up to during the story. It's also important to consider Flint's other activities besides searching for Klaus and mourning Hinawa. Lucas is the only kid his age in Tazmily, besides Nana, who doesn't have to work. This means a lot. Flint is one of the only men in the village from Tazmilly's initial beginning who doesn't work at the factory either, but it's clear that with the sheep still around, his livelihood to support himself and Lucas is selling the sheep's wool, the same job he was doing years before Tazmily had introduced any currency or expectation to pay for things. This is an important detail to consider, with how much emphasis the game puts into the sheer disconnect between the earlier chapters, where each villager is trusted to provide and create in exchange for being able to utilize any item they please, versus later where everything is running under the system of capitalism. You simply can't handwave away the notion of how Lucas and Flint were able to survive and stay afloat once Tazmily introduced money into their society. There's also the fact that despite apparently being constantly struck by lightning, Lucas's house is in the same condition as it is during the start of the game. So unless you're going to assume that Lucas is doing those repairs, well, Flint was repairing that damage each and every time, and intentionally not upgrading his house like almost everyone else in Tazmily, keeping it the same as he and Lucas remembered it always being. And while this point technically is about something that happens after chapter 4, it is lastly also worth mentioning that the sheep are still tended to, despite their pen being destroyed at the beginning of chapter 4. One of them even makes a comment about Flint not wanting to move to the big city towards the end of chapter 7. So, I say this all to indicate that so many things point to Flint having actually still been home a lot, despite searching for Klaus every day. Besides that last point, there's already plenty to digest with the 3-year time skip, but in comparison to when you take control of Lucas in chapter 4 and beyond, how does Flint affect the story there? Those 3 years and chapters 4 through 8 are independent bits of the story that don't necessarily indicate precise things about each other. Rather, what I mean is, the time skip that occurs in Mother 3 is a long time. I'd consider 3 years to be quite a long time at least. And yet, how long of a time are chapters 4 through 8 of Mother 3? Chapter 4 spans an entire day, chapter 5 seems to be less than a day, and during the start of chapter 7, Ionia indicates they'd only encountered Lucas a few days ago. Chapter 7 itself is just bizarre with its pacing, since almost the entirety of Tazmily leaves the village over what would otherwise be implied to be a fair amount of time, but in execution only comes off like a matter of a couple of weeks at most. That's another issue entirely with chapter 7 being so incongruent with the other chapters of the game, but either way, the chapters of Mother 3 where you take control of Lucas, it isn't a huge span of time. So what am I trying to say with this point? It's that no matter what angle you look at Flint from, to go off that amount of time to indicate that Flint was distant from Lucas, there's much more to it than that. Lucas being on his journey away from home is too short of a time frame to gauge exactly what Flint and Lucas may have been up to during that 3-year gap. So with that in mind, to try to analyze Flint in chapters 4 through 8, it is necessary to look at how Lucas is as a character, since it goes without saying that Flint's son is extremely important to analyze when trying to already do that for his father. The big elephant in the room that needs to be discussed is how Lucas is interpreted to have been a neglected child during the time after he lost his mother. I think it's fair to say that with the information that is provided in Mother 3, it's difficult to gauge what degree of emotional neglect Flint may have had with Lucas. Emotional neglect is something that is difficult to portray in media, in the sense that everyone copes with that trauma in different ways. There's no right way to be a victim. That said, Lucas is very much characterized as someone who is very capable and willing, and while that in of itself isn't something that can directly quantify the strength of Lucas and Flint's bond, it can infer that Flint's support was more present than what is actually shown in the game, chapter 4 onwards. I think it's reasonable to say that even though Flint doesn't fight alongside his son, He very well likely was supportive off-screen, before Lucas even started his adventure to find Duster. Remember, Lucas was a kid who was going out connecting with the Dragos. He is far more brave and strong of a character than most say he is. To say that certain things were occurring as an absolute, such as Flint being very distant from Lucas, and that Lucas was completely a shut-in from everything, is to suggest a more rigid interpretation of how things transpired during the time these characters had that the player doesn't get to see. I think ultimately, putting that Flint stuff aside for a minute, I feel as if the game presents Lucas as a far more triumphant character than what most players seem to take away from him. As I said, the ending of Chapter 3 is an excellent example of this, as are almost all of his battles when he's the main character of the story. So, to interpret and take away feelings that Lucas is ultimately emotionally strong despite his tragedy, is to in turn, in my stance, suggest that Flint was more emotionally supportive than what is shown directly to the player. And just to clarify, yes, while Lucas very much is emotionally stunted due to Hinawa's death, as demonstrated at the beginning of Chapter 4 for example, I don't think it is fully indicative of a lack of emotional needs being provided from other support networks. This doesn't even need to be just Flint necessarily, it could also perhaps be through someone like Alec too. Despite Lucas's ongoing grief with Hinawa's death, he is still capable to fight for what's right, and that I feel is one of the most important takeaways with his character. Instead of his grief about his mother manifesting in the way it did with Klaus, after time allows him to incubate and build his strength, he is ready and capable. That's how I at least interpret much of that time not seen by the player. None of this is to say Lucas definitively wasn't neglected, per se, but I do want to make it clear that the game is very open to how Lucas is as a character once you take control of him. Lucas doesn't speak at all, and the world around him tells his story, or at least most of it. But with the details it does give you, it shows to me at least that he is, as the game describes him, a brilliant young son. Lucas may be quiet, but it doesn't make him weak. And maybe these details aren't things most players would take notice of. It's not as if the median interpretation of Flint having neglected Lucas to some extent is unfounded and out of nowhere. But these little details matter a lot to me when looking at this game. Speaking of Lucas, the subject of his potential emotional neglect needs touching upon too. I've discussed this a bit, I think, in one of my previous videos, but this needs some degree of further analysis. So, with Flint's devoted searching for Klaus constantly, my interpretation is that it is done under the assumption that should Flint find Klaus alive, he'll be able to bring him back home to try to restore some degree of normalcy for their family. But here's what I feel people need to consider. What would Lucas's life be if Flint gave up on searching for Klaus? Really, in the sense that Flint's searching was a never-ending beacon of hope. And that hope may very well have been unfoundingly optimistic and even delusional, but does that matter that much? The way I view it is, Flint simply couldn't stop searching for Klaus for many reasons. For one thing, because at the end of the day, Klaus was just a child. He's so much more vulnerable than someone like Duster was when he went missing. Secondly, and more importantly, Flint wasn't technically wrong in knowing he'd see Klaus again. Knowing that it was even a smidgen of a fraction of a chance that you'd be hit with the guilt of giving up and then being proven to yourself you made the wrong decision having given up is enough of a reason to not want to have stopped searching. And lastly, and most importantly, Lucas was also just a child. You can't expect Lucas himself to have known what he wanted. Would Lucas be happier if his father gave up and wallowed in that defeatist acceptance? Or would he want him to keep going out there to find his twin? It's not meant to be a black and white issue regarding, oh, Flint should have known better to have been there for Lucas, because one, I already presented my points to suggest he was already heavily there for Lucas, but two, him being there for Lucas doesn't paint a character that necessarily would have been better off in that circumstance. Lucas deeply is and was connected to his twin brother. Losing him is shown to have taken such a toll on him. That's very obvious with the final battle of the game. Why would he want to give up on that hope that he'd ever see him again? To suggest that Lucas, by the start of Chapter 4, had moved on from expecting to see Klaus again, even though his father hadn't, just doesn't seem right to me. Lucas is a character with hope and resilience baked into him. Why would he go out to search for Duster if he was ready to give in to accepting people who went missing are just gone forever? It is no wonder in the slightest that Lucas is called Flint's only salvation. He is the one thing Flint has left and did grow strong in return for his father breaking down. Even though much of this passing of the torch was off screen, it does still matter. When Flint shields his son from two of Klaus's strongest attacks, it speaks absolute volumes about how much he cares for Lucas. And the thing is too, that Lucas isn't flawless either. He wouldn't say such a mean comment to his father about his boldness if he was. Well, jokes aside, Lucas is just as human as his father. Lucas has his demons, his feelings of fear and anxiety he can't shake, as demonstrated of course with Tane Tane Island. But Lucas is so much more than that. He is valiant to be able to do what he could, and Lucas being capable of what he is capable of, to me at least, means that his father probably helped him reach that point, in some capacity. I've analysed so much regarding these characters, but I ultimately want to stress this again. This is my interpretation of everything shown in Mother 3. My interpretation isn't more valid or correct than what the median viewpoint may be. That said, I want to talk about something specific. I want to defend my stance in the sense that, when having shared my interpretation of Flint's character and his role in the story before, I've actually been met with the critique of, well, even though you can, why do you choose to interpret the game this way? After all, the vast majority of people seem to interpret him different to how I do, so why was I being the way I was? I struggled to answer that question back when I was initially asked it, but I feel as if I've been able to understand a reasonable way of explaining myself. When doing research for this video, I rediscovered a quote from Itoy that he posted on his website 2 days before Mother 3 released. He said, "Mother 3 is a playground with plenty of room for your imagination to run free. The more you think about it, the greater Mother 3 will become. The more you feel it, the deeper it will become. The more fun you have, the more you'll grow." Essentially, he says the more you look deeply into the game, the more you will appreciate from it. The more you will grow, as he puts it. So in other words, you're encouraged to look into every small detail of this game, to think things through thoroughly, and to open up your heart and mind about the characters. Breaking down Flint into being a bad father is only a surface level analysis and appreciation of his character. Mother 3 is so special to me because it's a game that encourages its players to break down its world and characters, and to critically think about everything. That isn't to say plenty of other games don't do this as well, but Mother 3 is my special interest in that regard. Also, I feel like it's more interesting to give this game the time of day to analyse beyond what the median consensus is regarding its characters. You can claim Occam's razor all you want, but there is something there to chew on regarding how to interpret Flint. To use an allegory from the game, much like how many of the villagers adopt the popular culture that the pig masks introduced, many players might adopt a popular interpretation of what Flint is actually like, when in reality it may not be the most charitable interpretation, and even though it's more popular, it doesn't make it the more correct way of looking at this. With everything regarding final game and prototype Flint explained, it's time to ask, how would I have preferred it? Would I prefer the off-screen post-time skip Flint from the final game, or the more active story participant from the prototype versions? There's a few things to consider. Firstly is that it's a pretty common opinion amongst fandom members that reinserting Flint into those chapters that he was cut as playable from would lessen the dynamics and importance of Lucas's journey. I do not agree. For one thing, what happens in Chapter 4 and beyond with Flint in his prototype role versus his final game one does not dictate his actions that occurred between Chapters 3 and 4. In other words, if you do decide to interpret Flint as being distant from Lucas off-screen during the time skip, that isn't contradicted just by Flint having joined Lucas to go to Club Titty Boo. Likewise, him not being there to accompany Lucas during the start of his journey in the final game doesn't mean it's impossible or invalid to interpret Flint as having actually been more supportive of Lucas off-screen during that time. As I explained earlier, there's more than enough circumstantial evidence in the game to support that interpretation. This weird conflation that some fans tend to make regarding the idea that Flint being in your party during these chapters specifically would have made it so his role during the parts of the game we don't see was less up to interpretation and more rigid, I think that does a disservice to Flint's character and just critical analysis of Mother 3's story in general. Another thing I see commonly discussed is that with Flint being in your party, it impacts Kumatora's character as it is presented in the final game. Let's break this down pragmatically. Flint was to be playable in Chapter 4, and he was removed and replaced with no one. He was also meant to be playable in Chapter 5, and he was removed and replaced with Kumatora. As I stated earlier, there's no good evidence to indicate he was playable in the 7th and 8th chapters of the game. What does that leave us with? Kumatora would have had less screen time for exactly one chapter. And let me not mince words. Yes, her not being there to be present for the few important scenes of that chapter, like disguising alongside the rest of the party, or Duster regaining his memories, may very well in hindsight hampered her character development. But so much more major events occur after that, what with the Magypsies and the needle pulling, something she's more directly tied to than any other character other than the twins, as well as learning about Tazmilly's and her own past in Chapter 8. In terms of a trade-off, losing Flint's on-screen scenes and importance in return for one additional chapter of Kumatora. Don't get me wrong, I'm saying none of this at all to insinuate that Kumatora is the problem here. Absolutely not. What I'm trying to say is that the addition to Kumatora's character that is gained from her being in Chapter 5 doesn't feel like a fair trade-off regarding what we lost with Flint. In more specific matters, I've seen criticism of the idea of Flint being in Lucas's party, in the sense that Lucas having an on-screen connection with his father would potentially weaken the found family dynamic Lucas has with Kumatora and Duster, particularly due to Flint not being an outcast quite the same as those three are. I really don't agree though. For one thing, because Flint absolutely is an outcast amongst Tazmily Village, even if he doesn't exactly start out as one, but also this weird conflation that Flint being there would somehow trickle down to affect Lucas into somehow not being as close to Kumatora and Duster is frankly bizarre. Flint having a more active presence in the story, and Lucas's journey still having the same impact it does in the final game, are not mutually exclusive. And look, deep down I do know why these changes were made to Flint's presence in the story. I didn't mention this earlier during the prototype roll or why things changed part of the video, but did you know that after cutting Flint as a party member from chapters 4 and 5, Flint was actually supposed to cameo outside the family house, tending to the sheep? And I know why these would have been cut from appearing in the final game. Firstly because from a narrative standpoint, the intrigue of this character that was major early on disappearing leaves the player in a state of when and perhaps even if they'll return again before the end of the story. But secondly, the less of Flint that was shown during these chapters, the more ambiguous to the player it is as to what his actions and morality was, and the more of a shock it is when he finally does show back up on screen. Mother 3 is an intelligent game with such well thought out characters. It is abundantly clear they wanted to make a character the player would observe and question if he's really all that good, with all the unknowns regarding what he was doing being away from Lucas. And on that level, I can't really criticize the developers for the decision they ultimately made regarding Flint. That said, what I can criticize is the execution of that decision, because ultimately, I don't think they handled this ambiguity as well as they could have. I mentioned before that the way chapters 4 through 8 of Mother 3 are handled in terms of their passage of time during them is kind of weird. The pacing feels rushed overall, so trying to use that as proof that Flint was distant from Lucas, I don't buy that, since, like I said, Lucas's journey away from home is a very short time frame and can't be used to gauge exactly what Flint and Lucas's relationship was like during that 3-year gap. That is why I feel like the execution of removing Flint from those chapters didn't really benefit the story. As I was saying before, we don't know precisely what was occurring every day during the time skip. We can only make inferences based on details given after chapter 4 starts. So to make a blanket statement like Flint was neglectful of Lucas, or had he been more present in Lucas's life, he would have joined Lucas on his journey, that just doesn't feel right. There's still room open for interpretation, because the metric of what is shown during Lucas's time as protagonist isn't enough to be certain about his dynamic with his father. Not to repeat myself from earlier, but ultimately, Lucas's character post-time skip has such major emphasis regarding him being a confident and positive character. Lucas is gallant. He knows what he's fighting for and what is important to him, and he does care for the ones around him. For a supposedly depressed child, he shows strength that really can suggest otherwise. That is to say, despite everything that has occurred to Lucas before the 4th chapter of the game, Lucas's assertiveness and maturity in the time that the player takes control of him, looking at it from a practical standpoint, it certainly paints a picture that Lucas being able to achieve what he does suggests that he wasn't lacking the familial emotional support that many suppose he does. And with all of that in mind, I feel I should finally answer the question as to what I would have preferred, what the final game presents, or his prototype role of being in Lucas's party for a couple of chapters. I think that even though the final game presents a tremendously interesting and certainly flawed character, I still think I would have wanted him to have been in Lucas's party in chapters 4 and 5. because ultimately, I cannot see how that short description I just gave about Flint a second ago would have been at all different had he joined Lucas's party. He still would have been flawed and ambiguous had he joined you in those chapters. He was still going to be the guy who lashed out in front of his kids and attacked others. He still would have been distrusted by the villagers and the subject of gossip about what he was up to between chapters 3 and 4. I suppose if anything, I myself can't be 100% sure that he originally during that time was to have searched for Klaus every day during the time skip, which is what I meant earlier when I said that toy interview where he mentions Flint kinda raises more questions that are left lingering. With that in mind, here's my treatment on how I would have handled Flint's character in the post-time skip chapters, based on all the info I went over, as a best of both worlds regarding his roles in the prototype and final version. So chapter 4 can start the same way as it does in the final game. Lucas awakens to an empty house, and despite the house itself having been targeted so often by the lightning strikes, the next target has now become the sheep pen, with that being blown to smithereens. The villagers still gossip about Flint, about how he's nuts for not having given up on Klaus being alive still, and that his supposed searches in just the mountains are ridiculous. But when you go over to Hinawa's grave, this is where he joins you, if for no other reason than to just run the usual errands alongside Lucas. Then of course, Lucas is called upon to locate Duster, and since Flint is present here, he decides to tag along to Club Tidiboo, having been one of the few men in Tasmilly to not work at the factory, instead making his living via tending to the sheep still and seemingly selling their wool. Flint has never gone up to the ropeway to the club. He's given motivation to go since it's somewhere new to explore for leads regarding Klaus, because if a lead regarding Duster, who was also missing for the same amount of time as Klaus, can just spontaneously show up one day in a random location, maybe he really can find something regarding his missing son. So Lucas, Flint and Boney make their journey, and do indeed find Duster. And going into chapter 5, by the end of that chapter, Flint does indeed find clues regarding Klaus, even questioning it when he sees the Pigmask's commander. I already explained chapter 6 earlier in the video pretty much, but I don't think it needs much else said why I feel Flint being present there would enhance the emotionality of that chapter. If going off of those unused animations of Flint is anything to go by, Flint at this point in the story may feel emotionally ready to meet and stay with Hinawa again. Not only has he found what is essentially proof that Klaus is still alive, but he's seen firsthand, in tandem with the player seeing, that Lucas is a capable, physically and emotionally strong boy who can fend for himself, who doesn't need his father's protection. And this of course leads into Flint gifting the courage badge to Lucas at the beginning of chapter 7, as opposed to it being proxied by Napolite in the final game. Here, Flint can directly tell Lucas that he's his only salvation left, and that he's grown even stronger than he is, and the courage badge being passed on being a symbol that Flint's courage is now Lucas's. And then Flint can disappear off screen for the rest of the game until he reappears like he does in the final game in chapter 8. Perhaps he's off to pursue that lead on Klaus independent of Lucas, or just needs quiet time away from everyone. And with that, Lucas can connect back up with Kumatora as the story shifts from strictly taking down the Pigmasks to going on the Needle quest. Now, none of that I feel is better than what the final game presents. I'm sure many of you will have heard me say what I just said and feel I may have butchered a part of the game. Maybe you don't like that Flint being in your party again sort of gets rid of that whole pacifist thing he has going on I discussed earlier. And that's okay for you to feel that way. I am just another fan of this game, like you or anyone else who enjoys Mother 3. My opinion regarding any of this isn't more valid than anyone else's. It also isn't precisely my prediction as to what his role definitively was in prototype material. Again, it's just how I would have handled Flint's role had I been involved with the game. With the 19 years of hindsight we have in the time since Mother 3 came out, I also feel like ultimately this would have been the best compromise regarding both ideas of Flint. Not only would Lucas still have his important moments in chapter 7 onwards, such as hallucinating Flint lashing out on him like he did towards the villagers in chapter 1, but in regards to that, it doesn't eliminate the aura of mystery regarding how good of a father Flint was. Yes, Flint was physically there for Lucas during the 2 days that chapters 4 and 5 occupy, but can we still be sure as to how he treated Lucas during the time skip? Why would Lucas still have these hallucinations if his father was seemingly that good to him? 2 days of being a quote-unquote good father doesn't dispel any implication of potential years of Flint's actions dictated from having been utterly grief-stricken still. And that's why I prefer this treatment, because it doesn't remove such a key compelling part of Flint's character with his ambiguous parenting. It doesn't remove the more realistic human reaction that Itoi mentioned in his interview. It doesn't remove the impact that's left from Lucas's connection with his friends, and it doesn't overall lessen Mother 3's message of the power of love. I feel like it enhances it all. Oh, and also on a strictly gameplay level, Flint being in Chapter 4 would have been nice. Having his swing ability to deal with all those groups of enemies in that chapter would have helped balance things out tremendously. What is left to be said about Flint? He's such a massively intriguing and thought-provoking character from Mother 3, one of many to fondly look back on, and although how he was handled in the released game does admittedly frustrate me to a degree, there is no denying at all how great of a character he is. I care about this character a lot. Like, a lot. And all I hope for I can do with a video like this is to get people who also love Mother 3 to see what I and many others do see in his character. I know I'm certainly biased in saying this, but Flint is someone who suddenly feels like he's commonly shafted, just in general. Like, did you know he's the only playable character from Mother 3 to not get an official plushie, and the only playable character in the whole series to not be on one of these badges from Hobonichi? Okay, I know most of you guys don't care about that, but my point is that I feel like this character deserves more reverence in the way the other main characters of Mother 3 typically receive. If you want to make a difference yourself, the next time you draw the quote-unquote Mother 3 gang, add Flint in there too, he deserves the representation. Also throw in Hinawa, and Salsa and Samba too, and anyone else from Mother 3 that you enjoyed at all. Why the hell not? All these characters deserve to be in fan art made by fans of the game. That ramble aside, there's so much more to Flint than just cowboy dad who neglects his son, and I really hope I got that across. I think at the very least I made my points better and made an overall greater video than my old Flint analysis video. Don't worry, I'm not going to take that one down or anything, but as far as I'm concerned, this video is definitely an adequate replacement of that one. Also, as far as talking about Flint more in the future goes, I know I said I wanted to put my thoughts on him to rest, but hey, there's still plenty about him with his prototype role we don't know, so if we ever do learn more about some of the story beats Mother 3 originally had before being cut, then expect me to discuss that in a video, whenever that may be. Hell, remember that N64 era bio that mentions he has a naive side? I'd love to know more specifically what that's about. So anyways, just to summarize my feelings on Flint as he is in Mother 3 for the GBA that we all played, I don't think making blanket statements does him justice. He is an amazing, thought-provoking character that serves the story well, and in my heart of hearts, I do think deep down he was a good, caring father, who tried hard to get by and loved his sons, despite everything. Maybe I looked into things a little too much this time, or not. I did shockingly actually have a lot of fun making this video, despite how much effort it took to do. Speaking of, this video took an enormous amount of time to make, and on that front I'd like to apologize to anyone who was waiting to see me upload again, but hey, I'll try to lock in on making some more stuff after this. Which reminds me, my next video will hopefully be another character analysis on someone else from Mother 3. Try and leave a comment and take a guess who it'll be. So far I've made videos covering Flint, Klaus, Mr. Saturn, the Magypsies, and also some of the other dads from the game like Wes and Dr. Andernuts. But I think this upcoming one will be a little different, so stay tuned and subscribe so you don't miss it. Peace out.